Picture a room in Washington, career diplomats, foreign policy advisors, decades of institutional knowledge between them. They're staring at a decision that every major US ally has warned against. The UN is about to vote 128 to 9 in opposition. Generations of diplomatic consensus are on the line, and the decision gets made anyway. The US embassy moves to Jerusalem. Now, the standard explanation goes something like this. It was Trump, it was the Israel lobby, it was electoral politics. And none of that is wrong. But here's what that explanation misses. The lobby that pushed hardest for that decision wasn't AIPAC. It was a Christian organization, 10 million members, 50 million people in its orbit. And its reason for wanting the embassy in Jerusalem had nothing to do with geopolitics. It was theological. What I'm going to show you in this video is that the most durable force in American foreign policy isn't a think tank, a donor network, or a strategic calculation. It's a religious belief held by roughly 100 million Americans that was deliberately constructed over 500 years by people most of them have never heard of. And once you see how it was built, American foreign policy in the Middle East stops looking irrational. It starts looking inevitable. Start with Mike Huckabee, April 2025. He lands in Israel as the newly appointed US ambassador, a personal selection by Donald Trump, former governor of Arkansas. Before that, a Baptist pastor for 12 years. He is not Jewish. He has no family connection to Israel, no ancestral tie to the region, no personal history there. In his first major speech in Jerusalem, he says his appointment is a divine assignment. He says his commitment to the Jewish people isn't a product of American foreign policy. It is a product of his faith. He says that without the Jewish people, everything he believes would be meaningless. Now, most people hear that and think he's playing to the crowd. Ambassadors do that. Say the right things, build the relationship, move on. Except Ronald Reagan, in his private diaries, not a speech, not a press conference, wrote that after Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon, he genuinely believed the Battle of Armageddon was near. George W. Bush stood before the Israeli Knesset in 2008 and told them that Israel was the fulfillment of an ancient promise. Joe Biden, in multiple unscripted moments, has called himself a Zionist. This isn't performance. This is a pattern. Republicans and Democrats, decades apart, saying versions of the same thing. And to understand why, we need to go somewhere that has nothing obvious to do with any of this. We're going to 4th century Rome. In 313 AD, Emperor Constantine issues the Edict of Milan, and for the first time in the history of the Roman Empire, Christians are free to worship. It sounds like a small administrative moment. It wasn't. For the previous 2 centuries, Christians had been the empire's persecuted minority, imprisoned, executed, killed in arenas. And then, within a single generation, the entire dynamic reverses. By 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius declares Christianity not just tolerated, but the sole official religion of the Roman Empire. The persecuted become the powerful. And they do what the powerful almost always do. They find someone else to persecute. The Jews become that someone. And the justification is already built into the theology. Prominent church figures, most notably John Chrysostom, the Patriarch of Constantinople, one of the most influential voices in early Christianity, have spent years constructing a narrative. The Jewish people bear collective responsibility for the death of Christ. The language he uses is not nuanced. Stripped of its historical framing, it reads like a hate document. That theology becomes law. Under Theodosius's legal code, Jews cannot build new synagogues. They cannot marry Christians. They are locked out of senior government positions. This is not mob violence. It is state-engineered, church-sanctioned marginalization. Systematic, institutional, and it runs for centuries without stopping. When the Crusades launch in the 11th century, officially a military campaign to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslims, Jewish communities in the Rhine Valley are massacred before the armies have even left Europe, not as a side effect, as part of the logic. Historian Robert Chazan identifies this moment as the beginning of organized ideological anti-Semitism in Europe. Not scattered hatred, but a system. Then, in the 14th century, the Black Death arrives. The plague kills somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. Entire villages disappear, and in that terror, with no understanding of how disease spreads, communities need an explanation. The rumor that takes hold that Jews have poisoned the water supply produces massacres across the continent. Jews are dying from the plague at the same rate as everyone else. That detail doesn't matter. The scapegoat logic is too useful. England expels its entire Jewish population in 1290. Other countries follow. The cycle, persecution, massacre, expulsion, repeats on an almost unbroken loop for over a millennium, until it reaches its final catastrophic expression in the Holocaust. And then, 3 years after the Holocaust ends, the State of Israel is established on the land of Palestine. Sit with that sequence for a second. 1,500 years of Christian Europe driving Jewish people out, killing them, making clear there is no place for them. And then those same Jewish people, having nowhere left to go, arrive on land in the Middle East. That is the foundation of this story. And it creates the central question: how does a civilization that spent 15 centuries as the primary source of Jewish suffering transform within a generation into the most powerful backer of Jewish statehood in human history? The answer starts with a man nailing a piece of paper to a church door. For over 1,000 years, the Catholic Church holds a monopoly that most people never think about. Not land, not armies. The Bible. The Bible exists only in Latin. The overwhelming majority of Europeans cannot read Latin. So the clergy read it, interpret it, and tell everyone else what it means. You don't go to the source directly. The Church is the source. What the Church says, the text means. That is what it means. End of discussion. That monopoly is also a power structure. And by the early 16th century, that power structure is openly corrupt. The clearest example: the Church is selling indulgences. Pay money, receive a document, reduce your time in purgatory. The revenue is going into the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. It is, by any honest accounting, a financial scheme dressed in theological clothing. In 1517, a 33-year-old German monk named Martin Luther reaches his limit. He writes 95 objections to church practice and nails them to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. His intended audience is other theologians. His intended purpose is an academic debate. What happens instead is a revolution. The printing press, invented only decades earlier, turns Luther's arguments into something the Church has never faced before, a message it cannot contain. His theses are translated into German and distributed across the country within weeks. His ideas don't stay in academic circles. They reach everyone. His argument is deceptively simple. Salvation comes through faith, not through payments to an institution. And the only authority on what faith requires is Scripture itself. Not the Pope, not the clergy, just the text. Which means the text needs to be in a language people can actually read. Luther translates the Bible into German and publishes it for ordinary readers. In that single act, he does something the Church has spent 1,000 years preventing. He hands the Bible directly to the people. Political support accelerates the movement. German princes see in Lutheranism both a genuine reform and a strategic tool, a theological argument for reducing Rome's grip on their territories. Within decades, Protestantism spreads across Northern Europe. Lutheranism takes hold in Germany and Scandinavia. Calvinism spreads through Switzerland and France. In England, the break comes for different reasons entirely. Henry VIII wants a divorce the Pope won't grant. But the structural outcome is the same. A new church, independent of Rome, different movements, different theologies, but one shared premise. The Bible belongs to everyone. Anyone can read it. Anyone can interpret it. That premise, once introduced, cannot be walked back. And 200 years later, it produces a consequence that none of the original reformers could have foreseen, and that would permanently alter the politics of the Middle East. By the early 19th century, Europe feels like it is coming apart. The Napoleonic Wars have killed millions and erased the old map. Darwin's theory of evolution is beginning to circulate, a direct challenge to the religious framework most Europeans have built their worldview on. Marxism is emerging. Industrialization is dissolving social structures that have been in place for generations. For ordinary people living through this, the disruption is total. In that environment, a specific kind of idea becomes very attractive. One that says all of this chaos is not random, that it is part of a plan, that there is a divine architecture underneath the disorder, and that if you know how to read it, everything makes sense. That is the gap that John Nelson Darby steps into. Darby is an Irish former lawyer who has left the legal profession to pursue religious work. He joins a small Protestant movement in Britain and Ireland called the Plymouth Brethren, and there he develops a theological system he calls dispensationalism. The idea is this: human history is divided into 7 distinct stages, dispensations, each representing a different phase of God's relationship with humanity. The stage we currently occupy is defined by tribulation, moral decline, and spiritual testing. It ends with a catastrophic final war on the land of Palestine, the Battle of Armageddon, after which Christ physically returns to rule the earth for 1,000 years. The system is designed to do exactly what anxious 19th century Europeans needed to do. Every crisis, every upheaval, every new idea that threatens old certainties becomes confirmation that the plan is unfolding on schedule. Darwin shakes your faith? Good. That's exactly what Darby said would happen in this stage. The world feels like it's ending. It is, right on time. But here is the part of Darby's theology that nobody expected, and that changes everything. He goes back to the Old Testament and reads every promise God made to the Jewish people, and he takes every single one of them literally, including the promise of the land. For 18 centuries, the Catholic and Orthodox churches had taught that those promises were fulfilled by the coming of Christ. They were historical. They were complete. There was no ongoing divine obligation to the Jewish people as a people. Darby says they are wrong. The promises are still active. And for the end-time sequence to begin, for the Battle of Armageddon to happen, for Christ to return, the Jewish people must physically return to Palestine and re-establish a sovereign state there. Without that, the prophecy cannot complete. Without that, history cannot end. This idea had never existed in Christian theology before, not in Catholicism, not in Orthodoxy, not even in Luther's Protestantism. Luther, it's worth remembering, wrote viciously anti-Semitic texts. The founder of Protestantism despised Jews. But Darby's theology says something entirely different. The Jewish return to Palestine is not just legitimate, it is a divine requirement, the precondition for the second coming of Christ. He is, in effect, providing a theological mandate for Zionism, decades before the Zionist movement fully forms. Darby spends the rest of his life preaching this idea across Britain, Europe, and the United States. By his death in 1882, he has established more than 1,500 dispensationalist churches. Most of them are in America. He has planted the seed. What he hasn't done is reach the masses. That requires a different kind of person entirely. And that person is coming. A disgraced lawyer with a criminal record, a Bible that would sell tens of millions of copies, and the Zionist financier who bankrolled it all. In Part 2, you'll watch a fringe idea capture the most powerful government on earth. It drops soon. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss it. I'll see you there.